was 10 years of age when I first began to wonder about the environment and mankind's impact upon the planet. My newfound environmental curiosity came to me in a rather abstract way, from the attempted suicide of my alcoholic father by gassing himself in the car parked in the garage at home, a hose running from the tailpipe poking through a gap in the rear window. And it was that day I learned that the exhaust fumes coming from the tailpipes of cars was poisonous, could kill people. A week later, I was out with my mother driving. I remember thinking to myself about the exhaust from all the cars and trucks and motorbikes and aircraft in the world, releasing their toxic killer gas into the air, and how it must have an effect. That, as big as the world was, one day all the gas would accumulate in the atmosphere and reach a level where it would kill everybody. And I was right. The emissions from all our vehicles, along with factory-farmed livestock agriculture and fossil fuels, is going to kill us with climate change. Now, it wasn't until I was 39 years of age that I began making documentaries concerned about the environmental impact of mankind. And after 3 feature films on topics such as resource depletion, overpopulation and climate change, presenting solutions like permaculture, renewable energy technology, relocalization and earth rights, I realised there was something missing from the whole environmental debate, something of deeply profound importance. That the wounding of the environment is a mirror of the psychological and emotional wounds within ourselves.
Well, yes, I do think that the outer environment is a reflection of our inner psychological, emotional and behavioural aspects of human beings. The way we treat each other and our, conflicts or tension or stress, or the kind of attitudes in the way in which we speak to another person, or the way we relate to our colleagues or friends or family members, all of that is also reflected in the way in which we treat the environment in many respects.
I feel that the degradation of the outer environment mirrors the degradation of our psyche, of our soul.
How you feel about yourself is reflected in how you treat all life. Animals, plants, people, everything. When you are plugged into a greater reality, and you being a part of that reality, you can't help but walk gently upon the earth.
We're very sensitive to the human impacts on the environment that we're dependent on, and people have been very disconnected from that, and I think that's a huge, the emotional gap there is a loss of love of life and a loss of joy in life. So I think it's more the joy that you get from relationship with the whole of life, rather than we seem to relate to a fraction of life. And that's the same in our inner world, that we alienate aspects of our emotional life because it's unacceptable, and that fractures us. So yes, there's a fracture within, and then there's a fracture in our relationship with the earth.
There are a lot of things, and the whole marketing process that just keep us distracted from our core loving, caring, communal, tribal self. And so it takes us into our individualism, our competitiveness, our worthlessness, that we're only worthy if we've got all these products and ownership and everything. And it's distracting from who we are, and it keeps us distracted all the time.
It's really important that we look a little bit deeper into our thoughts, our attitudes, our beliefs, the mind and heart, because otherwise, if we will recreate the same old political, social, environmental problems all over again, we'll keep repeating that until we look deeper inside of ourselves for, some transformation. Transformation on the outer sense in the environment has to also equally occur from transformation from within. They're interrelated.
The foundation for all global transformation is institutional transformation, and it's the the foundation for institutional transformation is personal transformation. And that's what, for example, gets forgotten in the triple bottom line. You know, people say, oh, it's a great step forward to move from measuring everything in terms of money and economics to society, the environment and economics. But amongst those three things, the person is left out. And for me, personal change is the thing that's actually got to underpin all of those changes, and that's why I got interested years ago in social ecology, because it's the only framework amongst all the various disciplines and meta-disciplines that actually acknowledges the importance of personal change in global transformation.
If we could look at ourselves in the mirror and accept what we are and who we are, that the vehicle we're in is the one we're in and we've got to make the best of it. That whether you've had an easy run in life or a difficult run in life, it's taught you stuff.
Yeah.
Okay? Make the best of it.
Yeah.
Focus on your ability, not your disability.
Yeah.
Then you can look at yourself in the mirror. And it's often those people who have had the worst run in life who teach us to love who we are, because they've had to learn to love who they are in order to keep going.
On this journey to find the self-esteem I'd lost as a child, I decided to visit the place where my father died a couple of years later when I was 12. He was sleeping rough on a bench in a Melbourne park on a cold winter's night, dying a lonely, homeless, sick, broken old man, his body ravaged by alcohol in whatever form he could get it. But on a global scale, humanity is also drunk, intoxicated by our success at fashioning nature in our own image, acclimatized by our televisions to the horrors unfolding, apathetic in uncomfortable comfort zones. I remember when I was 15 years old, sitting with my finger on the trigger of a loaded shotgun in my mouth, when camping with a friend and his uncle. It scares me still to think about that moment as a teenager. I hated life so much. But I didn't want to die, I just wanted to change. And here we are collectively with our fingers on the trigger of a gun that will cause our extinction. And is this not the same slow, willful suicide of an alcoholic that we see expressed in humanity's behaviour? Is this not the same low self-esteem my father had, that I had, but on a global scale? The bullying between people and nations reflected in the way we bully nature. Are we not all sleeping on that park bench, wondering if we'll wake up in the morning?
Self-esteem is a key issue that underlies a whole lot of thinking and action, and it stems from bullies, for example, generally have been bullied, and so there's a sort of what I call psychological shit inheritance. It just gets passed from one generation to the next. And when you get bullied, you end up fearful. And when you end up fearful, you've got to mask it by being demonstratively powerful.
Low self-esteem is a core issue, as well as inflated false self-esteem. I think both of those things are an issue. The inflated false self-esteem relates more to the bully or the narcissist, whose sense of identity has been developed by dominating others and putting others down. Whereas for the general population, the self-esteem often holds people back from taking that leap of faith to do something that actually they're talented at or passionate about or would love doing, but maybe it's out of the norm, and the rest of the community might be saying, oh, hang on a second, that's a bit risky.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, you have the victim of bullying, or people who are surrounded by very dominating or interrogating types. And then, so their self-esteem gets eroded. And we know that from an epigenetic perspective that has lifelong effects. Lifelong effects for the victim, who is most likely to have an increased incidence of depression and anxiety later in life, but that predisposition is then passed on to their children and grandchildren through that epigenetic encoding in the DNA. But we also know that for the bully, there are lifelong effects.
A therapist, or not a therapist, but a person concerned with alternative change, gave an example of him walking along the street and he saw a big bully beating up somebody, and he moved over and stood right near them, and he said quite loud, "If I saw somebody doing that to you, I'd stop them," to the bully. Mm-hmm. And the bully broke down and cried, because that's what had happened to the bully. There'd be nobody to stop the people who bullied him. Mm-hmm.
We're often so harsh and, with ourselves, we're often that harsh inner critical voice is often so dominant when there is low self-esteem. It's like we're so often attuned to that critical voice, as if somehow it's true and correct and real. But actually it's just the critic. It's just a very conditioned, deep-seated attitude of listening to that voice. And so we have a choice, really. We can train ourselves, we can either, because if we keep listening to that critical voice, we start to realize that there's no other outcome. We're going to feel miserable and not okay. That's the outcome, and it happens every single time. Listen to the critical voice, it equals misery. Low self-esteem, low self-worth. There is an opportunity, though, with positive neuroplasticity training, that you can rewire for happiness and well-being. And there's beautiful, beautiful courses these days that, based on mindfulness practice, that we can do that really enhance a sense of flourishing rather than getting stuck in the negative script.
If we come together in a more conscious way and with an intention to support and heal each other with this, then that can change not just our immediate situation, but in a sense it can kind of change legacies, ancestral lines of often what carries trauma and issues of power and control.
A lot of the people who are attracted to positions of power are the least powerful in our society in terms of their self-esteem and self-image. And so we have, as our prime ministers and politicians, paradoxically, some of the least genuinely powerful people who've had to gain positions of public power to compensate for their internal powerlessness and self-doubt.
Often what goes with power is around control. And I feel, it seems like in our society, if we could call it that the need for control is around generating a sense of security. Mm-hmm. And so the control over nature is to somehow generate this sense of security, which for me feels like a bit of an overlay, really. If we have a deep sense of belonging and connection with the earth, that's our secure base.
Yeah. I can go back to a time in my life when I was the most successful, making more money than I could spend, magazine covers, television ads, and I was the most miserable, unhappiest, most depressed human being. Yeah. So just because it's not something to aspire to, because you see these people, but they're carrying their own wounding.
Yeah, you think it's something that's going to make you happy and all that sort of thing, because it's what we've been sold, but when you're having lived the experience
How much stuff can you...
that isn't what brings happiness.
No, all this stuff is really adding layers and layers to hide what they feel inside. So I personally, instead of getting angry when I look towards certain public personas that seem to have it all, I feel a lot of compassion for them because I can see past that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things, and the whole marketing process that just keep us distracted from our core loving, caring, communal, tribal self. And so it takes us into our individualism, our competitiveness, our worthlessness, that we're only worthy if we've got all these products and ownership and everything. And it's distracting from who we are, and it keeps us distracted all the time.
20 years ago, I used to think that if only people were aware of what was going on in the world, things would change. Now I realise that everyone's aware and nothing has changed. And I think that the reason is that thinking intelligence without the benefit of the feelings is helpless, is sterile. And so we need the rage and the terror and the anguish and the sense of horror to enliven, to add passion to the thoughts, because otherwise we just feel like overwhelmed. And what can one person do anyway? And it's all probably too late. And, you know, so in the despair and empowerment workshops that I facilitate, that allow people to explore, that invite people, that encourage people to explore these feelings, what we realise is that deep down everyone thinks we're fucked. It's all over, it's too late, there's nothing we can do anymore. But that when those feelings get expressed, which never is allowed in the rest of our lives because it's letting the side down and we're frightened we'll be overwhelmed. If I were to fully open myself to these feelings, I'd commit suicide, I'd become so depressed and so on. That's not what happens. That when we allow these feelings, when we honour our pain for the world, a tremendous empowerment and positive energy arises up that is suppressed by that. And so the part of our inner environment that I'm the most particularly interested in is to recognise the intelligence in those feelings and to honour the intelligence in those feelings.
This is the first time I've actually been back to Dad's grave. The thing I remember most about his funeral was wanting to look inside the coffin to make sure he was really in there and wasn't coming back to frighten and hurt us anymore. His death was as much a relief as it was grief. And Dad's funeral was the last time I saw my 3 older half-brothers from his previous marriage. From growing up in a big family, it was now just my mother and myself. And Mum, she really had it tough. I grew up repeating the transgenerational dysfunction that was bred into me, with depression, alcoholism, drugs, theft, fighting, and attempting suicide with pills when I was 19. I hit rock bottom. But slowly, through creativity and persistence, I turned my life around. And just as it takes a messed up person to hit rock bottom before turning their life around, perhaps so too for mankind. But how big of a rock bottom will it take to turn our world around before it's too late? How bad does climate change have to get before we take proper action? Hurt people hurt people. It's a pattern. And hurt people will hurt the earth. Perhaps the thing we need to do, the thing I was afraid of doing in this film, the thing I needed to do as an artist to find my power, was to embrace vulnerability.
When we get in touch with our vulnerability, it's all human beings. It brings us in connection with humanity, because we all have that sense of vulnerability to sickness, old age and death, and the uncertainty of in this fragile life that we have. We all have that sense of wanting to be happy. You know, we don't wish to be harmed, and we don't wish to suffer. So all human beings have that sense of vulnerability. And in fact, I think it takes great courage to actually speak from that place of vulnerability, or to share from that place of vulnerability.
It's a place of honesty.
It's real honesty, it's truth-telling, and It's not sort of putting up a mask and of pretense or persona. It's kind of really deeply connecting with ourselves, and thereby, when we connect truthfully with ourselves, we connect with the other person. And so it's not coming from a defensive kind of position, but it's a real opening of the heart in many respects.
99.9% of us have had or have shielding around our heart because we don't want to feel pain. Okay? It's okay. Feel the pain. Now's the time. It does not serve you to have a shielded heart because you cannot embody self-love and unconditional love unless you are in your heart.
Anger is a way of staying away from our vulnerability. And underneath the anger is hurt, which is vulnerability. And it's really sort of counterintuitive that that hurt is where the information is about the action that we need to take. So it's a very powerful creative source. A core teaching of many of the great wisdom teachings is that things are always in flux. And that makes us very vulnerable. And we defend ourselves against that. And, you know, I think a lot of the harshness and the brutality of the power holders is a big defense against that vulnerability of change. And so what we're going to have to do is really face that vulnerability to survive well together and find ways of resourcing ourselves and supporting ourselves, because big change is already happening.
My own contribution to this is the only thing that's clear to me, and that's very much about deep ecology on the one hand and encouraging people to become much more deeply connected to their feelings on the other hand. One of the people that I quote in the Despair and Empowerment workshops to encourage people to dare to approach those feelings that we've been so terrified of. One of the people that I quote is the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who was asked by a student once, what is the most important thing that we can do to protect the earth? And his answer was to hear inside ourselves the sounds of the earth crying. And this was a stunning kind of an answer, not at all what anybody expected. And when I contemplate his answer, the only reason that I can think why this could be so is that it's only to the extent that we're prepared to hear the sounds of the earth crying that we are in a position to do anything about it. That if we shut that out because we're too afraid to feel it, our thoughts about the matter aren't going to be strong enough to give us the passion to really face this great monster of a culture that we find ourselves in.
And so fear is another defense against vulnerability, isn't it? So the more we connect with our vulnerability, the freer we become. And then once you've touched freedom, you never forget it. You never ever forget it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking for a moment, you know, just feeling in a way like this kind of process can bring up some vulnerability, you know, sort of noticing myself, you know, the kind of, well, this is a kind of exposing process in a way. There's a vulnerability, being filmed and being...
It is fun for me too, being a filmmaker, putting both ourselves out there.
That's right, Pete. And so I'm just kind of feeling into speaking from a more embodied place right now when I say this, you know, rather than a theory of vulnerability. You know, so as in this moment, you know, it may be, well, you know, I can feel in my body that there's wavers between feeling a complete kind of relaxation and then moments that kind of tense up a little bit my legs, and then I relax again as I contact that. So in a way that's sort of sharing my vulnerability. You know, that it's not that I always find situations kind of easy. You know, and so in a way, what happens, and when you responded back in a moment before, Pete, there's a sort of a joining. You know, suddenly we're kind of in this together. You know, where it's not just me sitting here and you're there. And this is the potential of vulnerability, is actually we come more into relationship. And I go, gosh, you know, we share this vulnerability. But there's a difference with sharing our vulnerability and living in fear. You know, that's a sharing our vulnerability as a strength. You know, this is quite a radical thing, really. I think it's still coming out of a kind of an old paradigm to even entertain the notion that vulnerability is a strength.
Making this documentary has certainly been a vulnerable thing, a cathartic experience. And my hope is that it becomes a cathartic experience for those watching it. A turning of one's obstacles into platforms, of one's problems into the solutions. This is the park where I was sexually abused as a 13-year-old by some random stranger, leaving me with all this guilt and shame and embarrassment. I never told my mum, and it wasn't reported to the police. It happens to so many kids. But why? Because we live in a world of disempowered people trying to regain their power in maladaptive ways. From pedophiles to politicians to the mafia, from outlaw bikers to outlaw bankers, and from the bedroom to the battlefield. Power games. However, like I'm hoping to do with this film, that abuse can be fashioned into something positive and inspiring. And this isn't just about healing our present wounds, but the wounds of our ancestors as well. From all the wars and violence and bullying and aggression of mankind's history, encoded in our DNA, the DNA of our past lives. But it can be re-encoded in a lifetime with vulnerability, humility, compassion, and love.
I specialised in working with child sexual abuse victims and recovery from trauma for many, many years in psychotherapy practice. And so you can see how children, through abuse, through the nature of abuse, really internalise that they are bad or that something's wrong with them. And so the cutting or abusive kind of self-abuse, if you like, can be really, certainly self-compassion can really be very helpful as a technique, if you like, and a very supportive practice that helps the person recover from trauma.
You know, we kind of self-harm in many ways. You know, this makes me think of how we even nourish ourselves. You know, as a self-compassion, what we take in, what images we take in, what music, what conversations, what food, what air. You know, these are all ways in which either we're aware or not aware, or have some choice around how we nourish ourselves.
If you're in a really damaging and abusive relationship, then you need to look at the ways that you prop up that relationship. You need to be honest about what you're getting from the relationship, because we never stay in painful situations unless there's a secondary gain. And that secondary gain may be a roof over our head. It may be that we don't want to be embarrassed. It may be a social position. It may just be the thought that, we don't want to be divorced.
Afraid of being alone.
Afraid of being alone, afraid of, perhaps another relationship ending.
Relationships are mirrors. So if you attract these sorts of people in, I kind of view it a little bit differently to a lot of people. I see these things as a gift. If I attract someone that comes into my life that is making me tap into some aspect of my wounding, then isn't that a gift?
So I think that mirroring does happen. I think that's there's certainly, there seems to be that dynamic of attraction around what's familiar. And I've kind of been curious about that too. I mean, why would we want to recreate conditions, particularly if it's been abusive or hasn't been pleasant? I mean, why would we want to recreate that? And yet it does seem to happen many people that I work with as psychotherapists, and when I think about in my own life too, I think, yes, that rings true. We seem to want to recreate familiar conditions. So it may be that some of those more external, more kind of obvious factors around sort of abuse, either of others or towards oneself, that may drop away, and yet it continues internally. You know, it seems like, you know, the moment I have a thought that I'm not worthy, or that I've sort of stuffed up somehow, or, you know, have this real put down as an internal dialogue, kind of recreates those conditions.
I really think that self-compassion is a very, very important quality in learning how to, with mindfulness, be able to attend to those vulnerable, tender places of our inner life, the painful areas, particularly if there's been abuse or difficult childhood or many painful issues, whether it's in a relationship breakup or loss of dear friend or a grief. To be able to learn to self-soothe and hold oneself dear, to hold oneself in a loving kindness and embrace of compassion for the pain that we feel. And with mindfulness plus compassion is a powerful kind of crucible or container for our inner life that creates transformation and healing and soothing of the painful feelings.
Our whole institutional structures and processes and culture and ways of being in the world have all, just like the individual has adapted to the oppression, those cultures and institutions have adapted. And so we've set up institutional structures and processes that accommodate the distressed behaviour in all of us. And so, for example, concepts of growth and consumerism and false power, marketing of false power and all these things are just institutional examples of things that are going on at a personal level.
Each one of us has to have, you and I have to have compassion and empathy for our own failure to have a small footprint. And if we can do that, if we can have compassion and empathy on that, since we're in the context of climate change, I think it's a very good example. Then we can really work together with the realism that is required to do this, and the sort of relationships that we have to cultivate to work together.
There's something so tragic about us having suddenly woken up and suddenly find ourselves to be conscious and looking around the world, and right at that very moment, before we've really had a chance to develop the beautiful things that we also find inside ourselves, as well as the greed and the violence, we discover the love and these other things. And before we've really had a chance to explore those things, it looks like we're going to destroy ourselves and the whole context. There's something that I just asked the question that if we could feel compassion for that situation rather than guilt, whether we might not find it easier to discover that there may yet be a chance for us to find a way out of here.
Self-compassion wasn't something I'd given much thought about until I began making this film. I'd been a cutter in the past. Self-harming is a form of punishment for being shit at life. But when we harm the earth, we are also harming ourselves. So in this sense, we're all self-harming. I decided to make Dad a new crucifix for his grave as a symbol of compassion for him. Compassion that he never knew and that I was never taught. But we live in a world where ulterior motives come with compassion. Colonization disguised as aid. Control disguised as free trade. And the system isn't broken. It was designed this way to perpetuate disempowerment. But ultimately, it's the earth that repays all our debt with her resources and environmental health. A debt the earth could not afford to repay either.
there's an important perspective that says, look, we didn't ask to be born. We didn't ask to be born in this world that is red in tooth and claw. We didn't ask to be born into a world that's full of hunger, and the only way to satisfy that hunger is by destroying other things and by competing against each other, and that the violence and the greed that we find ourselves saddled with, they were the very things that allowed us to succeed in the first place. Without those things, we couldn't have survived that incredible jungle of existence. And so now, those same things that made us so successful have become our undoing, and we can't go any further without somehow changing the very things that were selected to help us to succeed in the first place. So I see something so innocent about us that we wake up in this tragedy, you know.
John Seed and I have talked about this too, and a lot of social activists or environmental activists, how to stay positive when things are looking, when the time is past midnight, and in fact, you know, it has, and we're on a path that's kind of the degradation of the rainforests and our planet, and the poisons in the rivers and the oceans and the atmosphere and so on. And we're not going down a wise track here.
Yeah, we haven't changed course at all.
Really. No, and it's going to lead to a lot more suffering yet. What do we do? I've asked myself that question. In the face of despair and even, you know, okay, what do I do? Do I just sit there and give up? No. There is no choice. From my point of view, from where I sit, even if we fail, even if all that good work is to no avail, there is no other choice, I feel.
Yeah.
I will continue to do and speak out and do what I can.
Yeah. Let's say I'm not going down without a fight.
Not going down without a fight, and regardless of outcome, I think it's what's really important is that we hold true to that vision, even if that fails and we don't succeed. I don't think there's any point in falling into despair. That is not going to save us either.
It takes me back to a time as around a 13-year-old up in the Barrington Tops area of New South Wales where I grew up. It was prior to it becoming a national park, and I would go walking or ride a mountain bike into old trails through that forest, and I'd come across an area that was clear felled, you know, that had never been logged before. It was in beautiful wilderness, and it was just machines clear felling, and I felt that rage of injustice happening. You know, I spent so many hours in that bush. I just loved that environment. So I can relate to that feeling of anger. And I had entertained ideas of sabotaging the equipment, and, you know, and I could certainly feel that mind of anger. And as the time went on, you know, I guess particularly as I've come more into relationship with working with people and communities and issues of violence in our culture, particularly male family violence, and particularly working with men, you know, I've developed a lot more compassion and think, what happens again if I don't separate myself out?
Most people live in a kind of, in the shell of the ego world where there's quite a sense of separation between self and others. There's the dominant experience is like, I am here and the world is out there. And there's this subject-object duality. And the Buddha said this subject-object duality of that ordinary kind of consciousness is really the main source of suffering. It's one of the deep-seated kind of conditioned viewpoints that actually creates suffering, alienation, and that separation Yeah? So when we, inquire deeply into, well, who are we really? And we can start to open the mind to experiencing the trees and the birds and the dog and the wind in the trees right now, and the sound of the bird as none other than our very self. This is the interconnected self, the self with a capital S, great self, great earth, yeah? As one body, one mind, so to speak. And this is not just a philosophical, poetic kind of saying.
It's science in many ways.
It's both scientific, but it's deeply experiential. And that changes when we feel that we're not, the forests are our very own lungs. The rivers are like our veins through our very own body, that we sense this great sense of connection with the great earth. Then this changes our relationship to the earth as one of stewardship and care and respect for our environment, because we don't see it as separate from ourselves. In fact, our well-being depends on, the well-being of the environment and the sustainability of the environment around us. And so that deep sense of interconnectedness allows for wise and compassionate action that comes out of that space. When that sense of separation falls away between self and other, we no longer experience that sense of duality, then there is also no fear. The fear drops away. And when there's no fear, there is just love. What's present when there's no fear? Is it just a sense of openness and respect and kindness, appreciation, gratitude, love?
It's interesting that most psychology literature is about individuation and social psychology, and very, very little about relational psychology and how we develop relational competence is an absolute core understanding in terms of nurturing well-being and dealing with the problems we face. The book by Shemin Sari, We Have to Talk, makes this very clear in that they say, in a sense, there are three components in a relationship. There's I, you, and we.
The welfare of others is none other than the welfare of myself. And that's, I think of this term, welfare. It's like when I really, really want that to be for everyone, not just the odd person who kind of it's easier to like, but to everyone. Then this is it's like coming out of the mind of picking and choosing, This isn't easy, it's not easy to love someone that does something really kind of despicable to someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really hard, from my work, I work a lot with men that are abusive in their relationships, they're abusive in their families, emotionally, physically, sexually, religiously at times or spiritually. And I feel really strongly that actually I've got to generate conditions of showing respect for them to actually help them come to that in themselves and with others.
One of the ways to gain a lot of happiness, in some sense, is to focus on others' well-being. They say the happiest people alive and are people who actually care and focus on other people's well-being and happiness. Because when we focus on other people's happiness and joy and their flourishing, as well as our own, but when we also include others, then we're always happy because there's always somebody else who's also happy. So there's a rebound kind of effect there.
You know, it's a generalised statement. I feel we all want that at some level. We all actually want to come into relationship, and yet some of the ways we've learned how to cope, protect ourselves, does exactly the opposite. It pushes others away. So it's a real unlearning process. I think this is what's so difficult in that moment, in the split second of being triggered off, of going down that track of being abusive or bullying others, or kind of feeling a victim to it, or it's how to get underneath that, behind that, you know.
And so we learn through mindfulness that we can actually stand steady and be present to our unfolding experience and be open and responsive to that, rather than in a sort of unconscious kind of patterns where we might have painful feelings or thoughts come up. And if we're not mindful, we tend to react out from those painful thoughts and attitudes or that deep-seated conditioning. And so with mindfulness, it allows us to observe life from a place of relaxation, awareness, centeredness, equanimity. So we've got more of an ability to not just that knee-jerk reaction, but also it offers that pause, gap moment between stimulus and response.
It helps us to be more have more equanimity in the face of great difficulty, and as the great difficulty increases, which it will, because we can only move so slowly on this changing of the systems, people will have to have a lot of mindfulness. But underneath all the qualities of an awakened mind or a wise mind is the quality of attention. And attention is incredibly important. We have to pay attention to what is happening.
I went back to my father's grave to replace the old rotting crucifix with a new one, as a way of laying the past to rest, as a gesture of love, forgiveness, gratitude and respect, as a way of renewing his self-esteem and my own self-esteem. And something that I've realised within myself is that even though I would be considered an environmental activist, I would still rescue the life of a coal miner I saw in danger as quickly as I'd rescue the life of a climate scientist. And I feel that it is this common love of humanity that we must sow the seeds of our future upon. For in the moment of rescuing another human being, there are no prejudices, there are no judgments, there are no political or religious or ethnic divides. There is only the innocent love of humanity and the primal inspiration for survival of the tribe, of our tribe. It's said that those who live well must help others to live well, for the value of a life is measured by the lives it touches. And those who choose happiness must help others to find happiness, for the welfare of each is bound up in the welfare of all. And once we inherit the earth, we want to rescue her too, without pride, without prejudice.
Sickness and healing mutually correspond. The whole world is medicine, where is the self? I feel like this is a really beautiful koan which an Australian Zen Roshi, Susan Murphy, talks about. Yeah. And it's a really interesting inquiry into where sickness lies, where kind of healing lies. And what happens if we see the whole world as medicine? In other words, for me, what that speaks of is again like the conditions are all here for healing. You know, the conditions are all here for me to step into wholeness.
When we are meek and humble, and we are not sort of, our ego is not sort of driven by sort of self-importance and dominance over the earth. When we are in that sense of kind of openness and humility, with the great nature, and in fact in awe of it, and with that sense of amazement, then that sense of meekness, if you like, in that moment and in that experience, we inherit the earth because we feel we are connected and blessed. You know, the bird song sings in my own heart. That's what I mean by inheriting the earth right here, right now. Yeah. We feel that deep sense of connectedness with the mountains and rivers.
These are the important things: our connection with each other, our understanding of our dependence on the environment, the caring for it, and that inheriting the earth, it's like the ground of being. From a Buddhist perspective, I would say it's inheritance of the ground of being. And that's the freest place you can be, the ground of being. And it's where we can all relate from in a way that is harmonious and supportive and kind and loving.
And that's what gives me hope again for the future, is we've hardly scratched the surface of this sort of thinking and this sort of acting. Yeah. And you know, as people are watching this movie, they will come up with their own ideas that we haven't thought about, or you haven't thought about. I hope so. And what a wonderful thing that they'll be going out there creating new things and spreading them. And that's what Peckham experiment did. They were asked what really happened in that Peckham experiment, because they were looking at what enabled health. And they said, well, it was as if we made health contagious. And I think that's, in a sense, what we want to make is transformation, love, caring, equity, all these things, well-being, nourishment, contagious.
Yes. Excellent.
And the test of whether you're in the moment doing it is to be able to say, this is what I'm doing. Ha ha!
Well, let's hope we can inspire people with Esteem. Great. Professor Stuart Hill, thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure.
That's awesome.
I've heard some people suggest that the reason that we haven't found any evidence of life elsewhere in the universe is that everywhere that sentience develops, it destroys itself within a matter of centuries, and that's an interesting thing to consider. But you know, maybe you know, it's also like, well, why is it that we have millions and billions of sperms when only one is destined to be involved in the creation of life? Maybe the universe is so profligate that there are millions of Earths that destroy themselves and only one makes it through this particular sort of tragedy of sentience.
So, will we be the one Earth that makes it through this particular tragedy of sentience and evolve into a triumph of sentience? Perhaps we'd be the first Earth in this universe to do it, becoming our own science fiction with an evolutionary leap of consciousness. A technologically advanced civilization thriving in harmony with the Earth and each other, where vulnerability is the new strength, humbleness is the new sexy, gentleness is the new alpha, and love is the only weapon. I want this to be the Earth that gets through. I want our humanity to be the humans who make it. And we can, because just as the pain of an artist can lead to brilliant creativity, so too can the pain of the world lead us to esteem.